John, welcome back. We were talking about your expectations for your 50-year award.
Yes, I think it's very important to me that, number one, that I get the 50-year award. I want to be remembered as someone who practiced for 50 years, but maybe not a day longer. And I want to be practicing on the day that the award is presented. And I just think that's important. I don't think it's a good idea to get the 50-year award and have to fly in here from Boca Raton to pick it up. That's not my idea of practicing for 50 years.
During our break, you reminded me of some contact that you had with Tom Shriver's office when he was the district attorney. Do you recall those events?
Well, now that takes us back to when I was a newspaper reporter from 1970 to 1975. And I think that I got to see one of the best district attorney's offices that the city has ever seen. And when you look to see what those men, and I emphasize men because I came in 1970 right after Sissy Daughtry had left the district attorney's office. She was the first female assistant district attorney general in Davidson County history. And of course, that is today 6th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals Judge Martha Craig Sissy Daughtry. Back then, she was just Sissy. And I got to see her once in court, and she was gone. But the boys she left behind, with Tom Shriver running the show, his executive officer was Rick McCulley. And of course, the executive officer always has to be sort of the hard nose, and he was. Yet he kept everybody running smoothly. But the other names that I recall being there, Bobby Schwartz, Tommy Thompson would go on to become a professional district attorney general to the east of us. Hartsville, some of those counties over there, Robertson, probably Sumner. And Bo Edwards was an amazing criminal lawyer here in Nashville until his death. Mike Knoll, still around. Aaron Wyckoff also has gone on, has passed away. Ed Yarborough, still with us. And he rose to become the United States Attorney in Nashville. Hal McDonough became a professional prosecutor and left the District Attorney General's office just to go to the U.S. Attorney's office, where he was there for decades as a prosecutor. And then we had a sort of a comical character, very good lawyer, Doug Thorson, who was nicknamed after the Peanuts cartoon Pigpen. If you have someone in your office whose working area is messy, cube it, and that's the way it was with Doug Thorson. Yet he got his job done, but he was known throughout the office as Pigpen Thorson. And then Bob Strong. And Bob may still be in the district attorney's office to this day. He has always been the guy who handled financial crimes, and very quiet, very methodical, but it was a whale of an office and a lot of fun to cover as a newspaper reporter.
Did you have a chance to cover the String Bean murder or some other notable trials?
Oh, I covered several notable trials, but of course the String Bean murder trial was, although an open and shut case, the issue there was what the penalty would be. Because,
well, set the background for those who don't know about the String Bean murder. Who was he?
Okay. His last name was Aikman. and he was a Grand Ole Opry performer, and his wife's name was Estelle. He was a banjo player and comic, and beloved by the Opry community. And he and his wife were coming home from the Opry on a Saturday night when they were, and I think the thing that people dread the most, they noticed that something was wrong. String Bean had a pistol that he carried with him in his gear bag. He pulled the pistol out of the gear bag there, or costume bag, whatever, and went to the house to see if the intruder might still be there. He had recognized that something was wrong. He went in, and when he saw an intruder, he shot, and there was an exchange of gunfire, and String Bean was killed. Then there were two Brown brothers, I believe they were brothers, and one of them chased Estelle down as she ran from the car and killed her in cold blood. And their bodies were found the next day by Grandpa Jones. When he came over, he and String Bean were going to Stanton, Virginia, hunting. And String Bean found the bodies and called the police.
And you mean Grandpa Jones found the bodies?
Excuse me. Grandpa Jones found the bodies.
He was also a performer on the Opry.
Oh, yes.
And they were going to go hunting, but why do you say that it was a slam dunk except for the sentencing?
Because Joe Binkley, who was one of the defense attorneys, had used a tactic to try to develop sympathy in the community for the defendant who had not shot, who had not fired. And he allowed his client to be interviewed by Larry Brenton of the Nashville Banner to tell the whole story of what had happened. So it had appeared in the newspaper before the trial began. One of the participants in the crime had confessed to the Nashville Banner and implicated his brother.
And is that Joe Binkley Sr., the father
of Joe Binkley Jr., the judge? That's correct.
Okay. And what happened as a result of that TV interview?
Not very much sympathy was was forthcoming from the jury. Both were found guilty and both were sentenced to life in prison, as I recall.
Are they still in prison?
No. One died in prison and the other was finally paroled.
Okay. Were there any other memorable trials around that time period?
Oh, yeah. There was the Morris Haddocks trial.
And who was Morris Haddocks?
Morris Haddocks was a councilman and a druggist in Nashville. And Morris Haddocks was allegedly, he was never convicted of it, but it was alleged that he was accepting bribes to put zoning legislation through the Metro Council. There was metropolitan or councilmatic courtesy is what it was called, and each councilman was allowed to control the zoning in his district. And so if a councilman wanted a Kroger store in his district and Kroger wanted to build one there, they could go and make a presentation to the councilman. The councilman would say, this would be good for my community. Theoretically, this is the way it's supposed to work. This would be good for my community. I will introduce this legislation, and I will be followed by everyone else in the council because they will extend courtesy to me for my decision about my district. And Morris Haddocks was alleged to have taken bribes. The building was one on the border of Centennial Park, and there was a conversation was set up. They had someone go in with a recording device in his briefcase and talk to Morris Haddix. And Al Gore Jr., that's former Vice President of the United States, was a Tennessean reporter. And there's an interesting story there. Gibby Cohen was the head of the grand jury, the foreman of the grand jury. He was a young man, and he was much more outspoken than any other grand jury foreman I ever ran into. And he came to me and asked me what would I guarantee him as far as publicity was concerned if he could bring down a councilman. And I told him that he would get what the news deserved on the day the story broke. And he didn't like that, and apparently liked what Al Gore said in response to his question, and he cut Al in on the conversation that was had with Morris Haddix. And Al was
taped
actually,
conversation?
yeah, well, it wasn't just taped, it was broadcast. And Al could listen in on what was going on in real time. So that leads us, anyway, Morris Haddix was defended by Dan Garfinkel and Bill Wilson. And they tried the case twice, once to a hung jury and once to a not guilty verdict. Al Gore had to testify both times, and it's one of the most difficult things that a newspaper reporter can ever have to do, is to cover the same trial twice. Courtroom work is theater, and it's virtually the same trial over again, and makes it very, very difficult for the reporters to come up with anything new. In the second trial, there was a beautiful young woman in the jury box who would eventually, that's wrong. In the first trial, there was a beautiful young woman in the jury box who would eventually be elected foreman of the jury. She was from one of the families that have the whiskey wholesale warehouses. And I think there are 7 companies in Tennessee that distribute all of the alcoholic liquor, not beer, but liquor. And she was from one of those families. And Alan Cornelius was the judge in the case both times. Well, at the conclusion of the first trial, well, there's a little bit more to it than that. Every day in the trial, the first trial, a porter from the liquor company would come into the courtroom with a suit bag, and it would have her clothes for the next day in it. And Alan Cornelius found this to be almost theatrical device for him. When the porter came in the courtroom, he would start winding up for the day. And then the last thing he would do is have a dialogue with the porter about what the juror would be wearing the next day, and how things were going back at the liquor warehouse where her husband was unloading tractor-trailer truckloads of whiskey. And Cornelius made this pretty funny, and it went on every day. And then she was elected foreman, and they never could come to a verdict. Bill Wilson delivered the final argument in the case for the defense, and he was as theatrical as they come. He was an old-time try a murder case today and armed robbery tomorrow, and show up in general sessions for a jaywalking case. He did it all if it had to do with going to court. He looked just exactly like Phil Silvers, the actor, and intentionally wore black horn-rimmed glasses that made him look even more like Phil Silvers, the actor, and gave one of the best eyewitness identification speeches I've ever heard, where he would begin his argument with his glasses off and talk about how people said he looked like Phil Silvers, and he never understood why. And then he would turn his back to the jury, put on his black horn-rimmed glasses, turn around, and he would be Phil Silvers. And he would point out to the jury, "I'm not Phil Silvers." And that's the kind of, he really could get into it. And I always thought that Morris Haddix was guilty, and he tried, he couldn't do much to argue in favor of Morris Haddix because the conduct that was spelled out in the tape recording was pretty egregious. But he talked about, thank the Lord that thank the Lord that we live in a city where black people do not have to sit in the back of the bus. Thank the Lord that we live in a city where Morris Haddix can go into a restaurant and eat a meal. And he wove this into his speech and really got, he really got exercised. It was a great speech. So, and it worked.
Bill Wilson was white, and
Yes.
Morris Haddix
Was black.
black.
Yes, and it worked. So in the second trial, after 2 or 3 days of listening to the future Vice President of the United States testify and going through what we had gone through before, Kenneth Jost, who was a Tennessean reporter, and I were sitting side by side in the gallery trying to come up with something, and I looked behind me when the door of the courtroom opened and saw the girl, the foreman from the first case. And I said, there is an angle. She is back. Why is she back? And hoping that Kenneth Jost would not see her. But so the final argument was given again. Any newspaper reporter who covers courts knows this. You stay for the charge of the jury one time, and then you never do it again because it's long, it's tedious, and there's never any news in it. And so just as soon as the prosecution finished its final argument, we ran for the door, and she stepped out right in front of us, and Jost saw her, of course. And we, just as soon as we were in the hallway of the courthouse, both Jost and I said, Mary Jane or whatever your name is. We remembered it from the previous trial. And she turned around, and Jost said, "Why are you back here?" And she said, "Morris Haddix is guilty as hell. But don't you just love Mr. Wilson's speech?" And Jost took his notepad and pitched it up in the air and says, "We haven't got anything here. We can't publish that." And walked away. And when neither of us did. But it's one of those things that happens when you're a newspaper reporter. And I can tell the story today.
What happened to Morris Haddix?
Morris Haddix went back to being a pharmacist. He was acquitted the second time. And let me say this about Al Gore. He was made out to be robotic, and he was anything but a person who walked around looking like a robot. I had to stand outside the courtroom, outside the grand jury door with him on Friday afternoon after Friday afternoon, waiting for the true bills to be released to the press. He was one of the funniest people I've ever met. He told stories about his childhood, being the son of a senator, swimming in the Senate swimming pool with some of the great men of his father's time, and what they were like. Some were nice, some were crotchety, and he could bring them alive in these stories. And I always look forward to standing there with Al for 15 or 20 minutes because we knew when the grand jury was going to come out.
How long after that trial did he leave the Tennessean?
Oh gosh, within a year I would expect. It wasn't very long. He went back to Carthage to establish his citizenship or his residency there and was elected to Congress.
Well, you talked about Bill Wilson and what a great
He was an orator.
orator he was, what a great trial lawyer he was. Was he also a member of the Masons or the Shrine?
I don't know about Bill, but that was a story within the courthouse when I was a newspaper reporter, and there was no way to write it on the banner side. James G. Stallman, the publisher of the banner, was, I'm sure, a former potentate of the Shrine, and he was very pro-Shrine and pro-Masonic Lodge. Bob Battle at the banner, who I believe was the managing editor, was a former potentate of the Shrine. And we had several former, the courthouse was filled with Masonic Lodge and Shriners. And it became very obvious that the Shrine had quite a bit of control within the courthouse.
What was the Masonic Shrine or Lodge?
Well, first of all, I don't know a great deal about the Masonic Lodge. I do know that George Washington was a Mason, and the Masonic Lodge is still in existence to this day, although it doesn't accept women, and that I think has hurt it. But back then, it was a fraternal organization within the community. And like I said, it had significant political power. And I wrote a story one day, sort of as a joke, but it was true. Every word of it was true. Raymond Leathers had appointed a new grand jury foreman. And
He was the criminal judge?
He was one of the criminal court judges. And the responsibility for overseeing the grand jury rotated among the three criminal judges, Alan Cornelius, John Draper, and Raymond Leathers. And so I wrote a story that John, B. Doe, former potentate of the Shrine, had stepped down as grand jury foreman to make way for Raymond Leathers, former potentate of the shrine, to appoint his successor, Claude P. Doe, former potentate of the shrine. It was a very short little blurb piece. I typed it out on the teletype and sent it over because it was absolutely true, but I knew that there would be reaction to it in the city room because we were very, very pro-Masonic Lodge and the shrine. I had no earthly idea. It nearly got me fired. Bob Battle went berserk wanting to know what I was trying to do. And that told me that I was onto a real story. I never could do anything about it, but it was impossible to do anything in the courthouse and keep any secrets. Once one of the Shriners or Masonic Lodge members found out about it, it went through the courthouse. It just coursed through the courthouse like a waterfall.
Now, the Masonic Lodge or the shrines, did they also have black members?
I don't know. I just don't know enough about the Masonic. I think there's a division between black and white shrine units. At least there was when I was interested in it.
And is it a secret fraternity?
Oh, it's very secret, yeah.
So is the membership also secret?
I don't think so because the Shriners put on all kinds of circus and parades and things like that, and their work with children's hospitals is legendary. They have put a lot of money into it, but where you've got secrecy and where you've got a bunch of men that are having to run for election in order to keep their jobs, they were up to no good. And criminal court clerk Earl Hawkins would eventually be indicted for his conduct in the criminal court clerk's office. He was in the shrine.
So what happened to Earl Hawkins? That's a name that I'm familiar with.
Earl got indicted, and I'm going to have to beg off on that one because I left the Banner about the time that he was indicted. And the truth is, I was sick of it. I had covered the same beat for 5 years. That cuts two ways. The Banner was kind enough to keep me in the courts while I was going to law school, and that they could have sent me to the state legislature, or they could have put me out as a general assignment reporter. They didn't do that. They let me stay there, and I built up a lot of contacts, and it was very good for me. On the other hand, I knew into my fourth year, I was covering a trial one day, and it was a stabbing, and the victim was not killed. She was on the witness stand, and she was telling about the incident where she was wounded by this knife thrust into her belly. And she said that he stuck me with the knife and he killed my baby. And I nearly threw up. It was so real. It was human drama like you don't see anywhere. And she, of course, just broke into tears. And I said, I just don't have the stomach for this kind of work. And I didn't. And I never made any attempt to go to the district attorney's office, even though I knew everybody there and could walk into Tom Schreiber's office and have a conversation with him. I never even gave it any consideration.
Did Earl Hawkins get convicted?
I think he did.
And he held an elected position?
Yeah.
Okay. So the next person had to be elected too?
Yep.
And you don't know whether it was
You
just left?
Yep.
And when you left, you became a lawyer, and you told us a little bit about your first days, but tell me a little bit about what happened in your early years and your association with the Nashville Bar Association and John Kelly.
Yes. during the 5 years that I was a newspaper reporter, an arrangement was made between the Nashville Bar Association president and both newspapers that they would open up their board of directors meetings to the press, but would go into private session when they discussed disciplinary matters. This was before the creation of the disciplinary council, which is statewide and became a state position. Each county was responsible for disciplining its own lawyers, and Nashville had a huge responsibility because it had a big bar, big for that time, probably 1,000 members. And the Bar Association, big part of being on the board of directors of the Bar Association was to hear disciplinary matters, and every once in a while there would be disbarment matters, and that would have to go to the Chancery Court, and the disciplinary matters would become public at that time. But most of it was not. They worked it out. I was never on the board of directors when that was going on, so I don't know exactly what they did. But it opened up the Bar Association meetings for discussion, for the press to hear about things that were important to the community, because the Bar Association at that time had a significant political role in advising the mayor and advising the council on what was good for the legal community and what was good for clients in the city. By opening up the board of directors meetings, we got to see the discussions of why they were going to favor certain legislation and they were not going to favor others. It was eye-opening. And I covered every meeting that there was from the time they opened them until the day that I left the paper. And so I was known by the members of the board of directors of the Bar Association as more than John, the newspaper reporter who wandered around the courthouse. I got to meet them and discuss things with them. And so I went to Associates Capital Corporation, big finance company, and that's where my first job was. And if I haven't, well, there may be a better place for this, but let's move on to John Kelly. Dick Dance was my mentor at Associates. He ran the legal department. There were three of us, Dick Dance, David McMacken, and myself. And shortly after I went to work there, going to General Sessions Court, big docket for Associates, we had a lot of cases, and going to bankruptcy court and doing foreclosures. Those were my three jobs. And going to bankruptcy court would result in my career as a lawyer. John Kelly called me one day and said, "John, we want to have a newsletter for the Nashville Bar Association, and we would like for you to be its first editor." And I was dumbstruck that I would be asked to do something like that, because I was in-house counsel. I wasn't a lawyer like the other lawyers. I got a salary check every week, no matter how much money I collected, and I didn't have to worry about overhead, what my secretary was being paid or anything like that. I just went to work every day. And so I really wasn't a lawyer like lawyers are lawyers, lawyers in private practice. But I told him that I would certainly be interested in doing it although I had no experience at doing newsletters, and but I would have to ask Dick Dance first. And he said he understood that. And so I went and told Dick Dance that John Kelly, the president of the Bar Association, had asked me if I would take over this responsibility, and that I had told him that I needed to talk to you first. And he gave me a lecture that was so typical of the time. This was 1975, 76, somewhere along there. And it was so typical of the time. He said, yes, you can do it, but I don't want you to have any premonition that this is going to get you anywhere in the Bar Association. You are in-house counsel. They don't care anything about in-house counsel. And the Bar Association is run by the big law firms, the silk stocking firms, and you're definitely not that. And so if you think for 1 second that the Bar Association is going to invite you to be a member of the board of directors, forget it. It is not going to happen. And I said, well, I think I'm going to take them up on it. I agree they need a newsletter. I'm going to give it a shot. And he never bothered me about it. I don't know that he ever said anything that was to me about what I put in the newsletter. But it was called The Docket. And the first two members of the docket committee, or the newsletter committee, whatever you want to call it, were Jack Robinson Sr. and Don Binkley. And then the president of the Bar Association would come, and I would write most, if not all, of the stories. Jack and Don Binkley established the style that we had, and they were editors. And the president of the Bar Association would make suggestions for stories for upcoming editions and criticize certain stories. He didn't like the way they worked. And that, I wasn't accustomed to that. I was accustomed to whatever McLemore said went into the city room and pretty much came out the way that I wrote it. And if it didn't, then I felt comfortable enough at the Banner to argue about it and to demand why you're changing my story, you know. And that was not the way it was doing the docket. They had a particular goal, and they wanted things written a certain way on some issues, not all. A lot of it, I just did it. And we created characters, one of whom was Clara Heroblius, after Clara Hieronymus, who was the art and theater critic for the Tennessean. I never met her in my life. I don't know if she went to her grave knowing that we had used her name in the Nashville Bar Association for several years as a humorous character, because Clara would have an article every week about what was going on in the Nashville Bar, and she had a perspective very similar to that of Rosanna Dana, who was about that time showing up on Saturday Night Live.
How big was the docket?
How big was it? It was a legal-sized sheet of paper, and it was folded in half folded in half and then folded in half again, so that it was about 4 inches wide and width of the paper high, and it had different panels. And one of the panels had to be used for the address and for mailing, and then we would fill up the other panels with copy. And one of the things that we did is we started getting lady lawyers, and I thought that was just cool. Margaret Bim, along with Sissy Daughtry. Now, Sissy Daughtry and I didn't know each other back in those days. She, like I said, she passed a little ahead of me, but Margaret Bim knew me, and she had her lady lawyer, bar people. She didn't hesitate to call you on the phone and ask stuff, and so the lady lawyers, amazingly enough, started having babies. and so I started putting birth announcements in the docket. And, and there was you would have thought that, well, Bobby Garfinkel told me one time that the worst mistake he ever made in journalism was when he was at working for a Jewish newspaper in Baltimore, Maryland, and he took the sundown time out of the paper for Fridays when Shabbats began, and caused a huge uproar. Well, putting birth announcements, this sounds silly, but putting birth announcements in the docket made some people very upset. They didn't like it, and they were men, not women. And although I would occasionally get the phone call from a friend of someone who had given birth, and they would say, John, they don't know if that baby's going to make it. Don't announce that birth. Very calmly, very rationally, and I would not announce that birth. So this came up in the discussion. John, birth announcements are in the Tennessee end of the banner. I don't think we need birth announcements. Well, I sort of thought that was silly. And so...
So how did the docket grow?
Well, wait a minute.
Oh.
So what I would do is I would put things in like, Margaret Bim was scheduled to appear in Chancery Court on Friday, but couldn't make it because she had a baby. And I would put the name and the weight of the baby in and it was like just sort of chit-chat stuff. But they gave up trying to get me under control on things like that. So the docket grew. And I know where you're going here. One of the things the docket did was announce the nominees for the board of directors of the Bar Association. That came every November. And I would go around. I would actually go around and interview. I had to walk from Associates Capital Corporation down at 6th and Broad to the courthouse. And because I was walking around so much, the law offices were right along my path. And so I would actually go and interview every nominee and take their picture and put the picture as a headshot in the November docket. Well, it dawned on me I could get a picture of the new officers of the Bar Association by taking my camera to the annual banquet where they were announced and getting them together and shooting a picture. Well, there were 36 frames on a roll of film. Gosh, 100 years from now, nobody will realize that. But we had film cameras back then, not digital cameras. And there were 36 pictures on a roll of film. So I would snap the other pictures, and we began to have extra pictures. And they began to pile up. And what are we going to do with these pictures? And I think right now would be a really good time to take a break, and then we will talk about the birth of the photo extravaganza.
Thank you.
So let's pick back up with the expansion of the docket to include the two photo extravaganzas we would do each year. Once I started taking pictures at the annual banquet and at the annual picnic, Ed Yarborough started bringing his camera, especially to the picnic. And we were a team. We were both shooting pictures. We both loved photography. I had a dark room at my house, and we began to produce all of these black and white pictures. So what would we do with them? We'd get a big poster board. We would invite our friends to come to somebody's house. Often it was Bill Koch's house. We went there more than once. And we would have barbecue and baked beans, and there would be all kinds of beverages, as you might imagine. And we would cut out the pictures and make a giant collage on both sides of the poster board. And we would publish that in the docket the next month, and people loved it. Now, one of the things that made people love it so much was the captions. Jimmy Cheshire was the calligrapher, but everybody had suggestions about how to name people. Some people, like Miss Rebecca Thomas, who was one of the pioneer lady lawyers in Nashville, would be called Miss Rebecca Thomas. You would never fool with that. You wouldn't even call her Becky. She was sort of the anointed princess of the bar, and she deserved the respect that she got, and it was high. So you wouldn't fool around with people like that. But Frank Clement Jr.? Oh, yes. Would we name Frank Clement Carol McCoy? Yep, we would. And would we name Carol McCoy Frank Clement? Yep, we would. And would we have them in the same picture together? Probably. And we would do things like that intentionally. We would give people pseudonyms that weren't other people's names, but Batman or Superman or whatever that might fit. And people loved it. They really, really liked the photo extravaganza. Some people saved them for years. And the big boards are now in the Metro Archives. And it was just something that created great collegiality within the bar. People liked to have their picture in. They never complained. They never called and said, McLemore, you put a stupid picture in. Okay. But there were things that did happen. We were at the Crockett Springs for the picnic golf tournament thing, and the domestic relations judge, Muriel Robinson. I don't know if she was a judge at the time, but at any rate, she went swimming, and she had on a sparkly one-piece bathing suit, really sparkly. And we took a bunch of pictures of her, and they came out just great. Well, she realized that belatedly, before she stopped us from taking pictures of her, that we had a bunch of pictures. Well, she called and wanted to know if she could come to the photo extravaganza identification party. Sure, Muriel, of course you can. She shows up in her baby blue Cadillac, and everybody sits down to eat. Muriel is over at the table where all the pictures are sitting, and she begins to flip through them, and nobody notices. But when it comes time to put together the photo extravaganza, Muriel's gone, and so are all the pictures of her. And we knew what we had to do. There's a time in your life when you just got to do what you got to do. And we had the negatives. So for the winter photo extravaganza that was coming up, we blew Muriel Robinson up about this big, lying down on a lounge chair and sunbathing, and we put her from one side of the photo extravaganza to the other, and with a big caption, "Sparkle Lady." And I'll have to say this, Muriel didn't complain. She was upset, and we got word that she was upset. And my law partner, Bobby Garfinkel, was going, I have divorce clients. I can't, whether it was, Muriel had a good divorce practice, so whether she was the judge or whether she was just over there, he was appalled that we would do such a thing, but we did it, and it was funny. And that was the spirit of the whole thing.
I know that you were very busy with the docket, the photo extravaganza, but you met a lot of lawyers through your association with the bar. One was a memorable individual, Bill McHugh.
Bill McHugh practiced in the same area that I did, commercial law. He represented GMAC for years, and he knew his stuff, and was a worthy opponent, but he was also a character of the bar, just a wonderful person to talk to, and he wore a wig, and he looked like what you might think Edgar Allan Poe would look like if Edgar Allan Poe came back to the Nashville Bar and practiced in the General Sessions Court. And
He was very tall and thin.
he was tall and thin, and he remembered things. I remember one time telling him that our daughter's name was Meg, but we often called her Meggie Doodle. And Bill McHugh found out when Meggie Doodle's birthday was, and he would call her and he would ask for Meggie Doodle on the phone. She had no earthly idea who Mr. McHugh was, but he would call her and talk to her on her birthday. That's the kind of guy he was. Well, I have a story, another photo extravaganza story. We got Bill McHugh to represent the senior members of the bar at the photo extravaganza assembly parties because we didn't know all those old lawyers, and Bill knew them all, and he could feed us the names of those people just like that. So we were starting out one evening, and I looked down on the table, and there was a photograph of a particular lawyer who I had had a run-in with in the General Sessions Court a couple of days before. And what he had done to me was unethical and terrible, and I didn't have a newspaper that I could write about it in anymore. Couldn't put it in the docket for sure. And so I held up his picture, and I said, watch out for this guy. He is bad news. The next thing I knew, Bill McHugh had me by the elbow and was leading me back into the kitchen of the house where we were having the photo extravaganza party. And he was not harsh, but he was firm. And he said, John, you are not doing yourself any good at all by making comments like that. He's your fellow lawyer. If you've got a problem with him, deal with it. But you don't deal with it behind his back. And I said, Bill, you're exactly right. I will not, I appreciate this, and I will certainly do as you have instructed me. And so we went back out, and there was nothing more said about it until 2 years later. And we were going through pictures again. Bill McHugh was there representing the old folks. And he reaches down on the table and he pulls up a picture of the same lawyer. And he says, folks, I want you to look at this. I have never seen a young lawyer more desirous of a meeting with the disciplinary board than this young man right here. And I took him by the elbow, guided him out into the kitchen, and I said, that's the same lawyer that I made the same comment about 2 years ago. And you're not helping yourself. And about that time, he looked at me and says, when I spoke to you, I was instructing a young lawyer on how he is to conduct himself. Tonight, I was saving the profession.
And who is this lawyer that goes unnamed?
As the lawyer who goes unnamed will not be named here because he straightened his act up, amazingly enough. Apparently somebody grabbed him.
I think Bill McHugh may have grabbed his shoulder.
He may have, but,
didn't
but,
Bill
and
McHugh-
let me say this. I actually call him today for advice in his particular area of expertise. And, like I said, somehow somebody rescued him.
We all need to be rescued one time or another. But one thing that Bill McHugh did is he was a quiet benefactor.
Oh, yes. He and his wife was one of these legendary women who goes into a corporate organization and becomes apparently irreplaceable. And she rose in national life to a, whether or not her position was a high position of authority, I don't know, but it was a high-paying position. And she was there for years and years and years, and of course Bill, they had no children. And Bill, I'm sure, put away and wisely invested his money. And when, in their wills, they created a trust fund for the Legal Aid Society. And what a wonderful thing to do.
Right. You had so many of these photo extravaganzas that ultimately you had to create sort of an archive, right?
Well, yes, we made mistakes early on. We should have identified every picture that we had, but we didn't. This is something that it hurts me even to talk about it, but I made up books each year with photographs and with negatives. In January, February of the next year, I would take the book to the Nashville Bar Association because I thought that would be a place where it would, without a doubt, be preserved. I started identifying the pictures, but it was after we'd gone to color. I didn't identify any of the black and whites, and we've had to go back and do those. But apparently when the Bar Association moved from the Union, what was it, Union Trust Building? When it moved from the Union Trust Building to One Nashville Place, apparently a box containing a lot of those loose leaf binders of pictures didn't make the trip. And we lost several years of pictures. And it just hurts to talk about it. But at least one box made it because we still have a bunch of them. And I have gone back and tried to identify every one of those pictures so they can be searched. And we have about 10,000 pictures that are identified and can be searched.
Are you still taking photos
Absolutely.
and still identifying?
It's still at every. I will not allow my pictures to be put up on the Bar Association website until I have the identifications for them.
What happened to the photo extravaganza and the annual party?
Well, after 9 years of being editor of the docket and working with some of the most wonderful people, I had to call it quits. And Ed Yarborough was the last president that I ran the docket for. And then it went to a new editor, and its name was changed to the Nashville Bar Journal, and it grew. I was sort of in a rut, and it needed new blood, and it got new blood, and it's what it is today. And it's a matter of fact, I was just reading it yesterday.
Very professional.
Yeah, it is much more professional than what I did.
Do you still contribute to it?
Yeah, I do, when people ask me to. I write, That's one thing that we can stop right now and say in the middle of an oral history nobody will pay any attention to. I'm a compulsive journalist. And since about 1976, maybe, I have kept a journal, a page a day, every day, and they are bound into volumes, and arrangements are being made for them to go to the Metro Archives. We have not yet determined what sort of embargo will have to be on the volumes, but there will have to be something because there is attorney-client privilege in those volumes. And so 100 years seems too much, 5 years seems too little.
I'll introduce you to Donna Nicely, former director of the Nashville Bar. She's right now working on an archive project, but she would be a very good consultant since this is in the middle of this interview. Let me segue now to Trustees to the Stars and how you met Dottie West.
Dottie West was a country music star, a prodigy, really. She came out of the Upper Cumberland, and she had some wonderful hit songs, very popular. I still get people calling me to this day to ask questions about my experiences with Dottie West. I was appointed her bankruptcy trustee, and she made a terrible mistake. Jim Kelly had represented Dottie, and he was trying his best to get her tax problems straightened out and advised her not to file bankruptcy until a specific date. She must file. She was going to inevitably have to file, but she needed to wait to a particular date. She was about to lose her home, and she panicked, and she didn't tell Jim Harris, her bankruptcy lawyer, that the advice that she had gotten from Jim Kelly, the tax lawyer. And Harris filed. I was appointed trustee, and her house of cards really fell apart. And she had moved out of her home, and we had photographs that were given to us by people who knew that she was hiding assets. And the photographs were of Christmas parties at her house. Apparently every year she had a big Christmas party. And there you would see all these country music stars in the photographs. But what we were looking at was furniture. Where was the furniture? And it became detective work. It wasn't anything but that. We were very, very fortunate that we represented one of the largest storage locker companies in Nashville at the time. I kept picking at the problem. Who took the furniture? Where did it go? And a little piece and a little piece and a little piece would come together. And I found out that Captain Bob, someone who was called Captain Bob, had been with the group that packed up all of Dottie's furniture and moved it into storage. And I kept searching for Captain Bob, but that's all I had. But any documents that we had, we would look for the name Bob. We would just keep pushing on that. And one day I made a phone call to Branson, Missouri, and a little girl answered, a child. And I said, "Hello, I need to talk to Captain Bob." And she said, "Oh, that's my daddy." And she went and got her father. And of course, we nailed him then. We knew who he was. But he wasn't telling us anything, but we ran his name through the database at our client's office. They had thousands of storage lockers around Nashville. And they gave us the numbers of two 10 feet wide, 30 foot long storage lockers side by side over around Radnor Yards. And I got an order of the court allowing me to cut the locks off of those two lockers. And we did. And there was a huge collection of furniture. And at the same time, Dottie was trying to continue her career, and she was late for the Opry one night. She pulled into a gas station in Green Hills. Her car wouldn't start when she tried to restart it. She went over to a man and said, "I've got to get to the Opry. I'm Donnie West, and will you please take me?" And the man took her. Zoom, went to 440, went out to Briley Parkway, headed to the Opry, and she apparently was encouraging him to go faster and faster. And on the big curve where you get off of Briley Parkway and curve into the parking area at the Opry House, he lost control and she was killed. At that time, I had a former employee of Dottie's who was telling us about all of her silver and how it had been distributed among the family members and not moved into storage because we didn't find any sterling silver, and she had a lot. She had a room or a big closet in her house that was lined with that purple velvet cloth that you put silver on, and it makes it look so good. And I was pursuing that pretty hard when she was killed. And I got a phone call one day from Frank Childress, the U.S. trustee for Tennessee and Kentucky. And he said, "John, shut it down. Just shut the case down." It's the only time I was ever told to stop pushing on a case. He said, it's just too hot, too much public opinion about it, and you're being played as a real villain, whether you realize it or not, and to shut the case down. So we never got to Dottie's silver, but I would have gotten it eventually.
Well, there was another situation in which you were involved having to do with Mike Curry and his involvement in a bank down in Pulaski, I think.
Well, that's true. Mike was the president of the bank, and his father had been the president before him. And that was one of the great serendipities of my life. Mike mishandled funds of the bank for the benefit of his brother in particular, who was a big farmer down there. And he got caught. As anybody who is that high profile in the community is going to get caught. You're going to get caught by bank audits. You're just going to get caught. And Mike was using the bank's money to bankroll the family farm. And I get this call from John Hollins Sr. And he tells me, "I want you to put Mike Curry in bankruptcy." And his purpose was an interesting strategy, and it can work, and it worked with Mike. Mike was getting sued by a lot of people, civil suits, and Hollins was trying to defend a criminal case. And by putting Mike in bankruptcy, although we couldn't get a discharge for him, we could turn those civil suits into claims in bankruptcy. And that was the strategy involved. And so I told John that I thought I could stop the lawsuits. And he had money to pay me to do it. And I said, just have Mike come by my office and we'll get started. And he said, I can't quite do that. And I said, why is that? He said, well, because he's at Parthenon Pavilion on suicide watch. And I said, well, that's going to cost you more money. He says, I've got the money, just get him into bankruptcy. And so I started going in the evenings to Parthenon Pavilion to fill out Mike's bankruptcy schedules. He would tell me later on, many years later, that my visits to him were so uplifting. And I thought that was the craziest thing I'd ever heard in my life. And he says, no, John. He said, after you would leave, I would go back to my room, and I would crawl into bed, and the last thing I would think before I went to sleep is, Mike, today you were not the craziest person in Parthenon Pavilion. and we hit it off. And I corresponded with him while he was in prison. He stayed for 4 years. And he wrote me one day and said, I can get out on parole if I can get a job. And I wrote him back that we always hire a summer clerk. I'll hire you as our summer clerk. He wrote back and says, the powers that be over here and other inmates who knew what was going on said, that won't work. That's not enough job. And I called Bill Colson of Bill Colson Auction and Realty, and I said, look, I want you to hire somebody. No questions asked. He's coming out of prison. Find a job for him, and I will share that employee with you. He'll work for me and he'll work for you. And Mike Curry came to work for us as a runner, and he came to work for Bill Colson at the auto auction that Bill had, where he took off old license plates, got cars started. It was a miserable job, but it was something. And that leads us to the morning in in Smithville, DeKalb County, when everyone woke up missing $20 million. And that was the B. Don James case. And B. Don James was an insurance broker, I believe, in DeKalb County in Smithville, Tennessee. And he had a lending scheme, which was a Ponzi scheme. I called my field man, John King, and told him, you've got to get to Smithville as quickly as you possibly can. I'd been appointed trustee. I should always say that. I got appointed trustee by the bankruptcy court and told to get to work on the case. And I called John King. I said, get to Smithville as quick as you can go and get the records, because if we don't, we're going to lose them to the FBI and the TBI, and we'll never get them. And take Mike with you. I thought Mike could be of help as a strong back, if nothing else. And Mike Curry began to look at the records that we recovered, and we recovered quite a few. And he started looking at him, and he kept telling Bobby Garfinkel, there is another person in this Ponzi scheme. They're bleeding money off the Ponzi scheme. Somebody is actually making a profit off of this Ponzi scheme. It's not, as Ponzi schemes progress, they eat up a lot of the money because you have to feed, you have to continue to make the dividend every month or every quarter, however it's set up. And Mike saw that that wasn't what was happening. And finally, Bobby Garfinkel said, look, Mike, if you think that you can prove this, just have at it. Just go for it. And we just turned it over to him. And he was able to show us that there was a partner in the Ponzi scheme and that he had bled off hundreds of thousands of dollars. And Mike's work resulted in a state court judgment against that man for $8 million. And that was the beginning of Mike Curry, the investigator. I have said many times, and I'll say it again, if you dropped a quarter in the storm drain on Broadway in front of the Customs House, Mike Curry would find it in the Cumberland River. He was that good. And he proved that over and over for us, working for us in our office. As a result, he was attacked by people, and
Verbally?
not physically, but mentally and emotionally, because they would keep bringing up his criminal conviction, a price that you have to pay when you have a felony conviction. But George Payne finally put that to an end in the bankruptcy court by telling, this was probably 5 or 6 years after Mike had gotten out of prison, and he told the offended party that it was none of their business, and that everybody involved in the case should take a look to find out how much Mr. McLemore was charging and find out how much Mr. Curry was charging, and they were getting a whole lot more out of Mr. Curry than they were getting out of McLemore, which was typical George Payne. And Mike got the court reporter to transcribe that, and he scotch taped it to a filing cabinet next to his desk. It stayed there for years.
Where is he now?
He's dead.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear
He
that.
died last year.
Natural causes?
He bumped his head and apparently ended up having a cerebral hemorrhage. And it really came at it. It was a real surprise. It's not something I'm quite over with yet. But
I'm sorry to hear that. What about the Forsyth Title and Escrow account?
that was
Chris?
another Mike project. Forsyth Title and Escrow. We got a call from a title company, big title company, and they wanted us to tell them why it was that after they had performed an audit on Forsyth Title and Escrow and given them a clean bill of health, that within like 60 days, they came up short $2 million in their escrow account. And we had to completely audit that agency in Hendersonville. And again, it resulted in a criminal conviction, and but Mike was the one. Mike and Ghulam Zaid. Ghulam Zaid had come, he's not on your list, but he's now the head of Logic Force in Nashville. He had been a summer clerk for us, and as a result went to the University of Louisville Law School and came back to us. And he wanted desperately to do for a living what I did. That is, be a bankruptcy trustee, be a receiver, he just loved the hunt. And Mike trained Ghulam in how to go find the stolen money, something that Mike knew a lot about from having been involved himself. Sometimes it takes a thief to catch a thief. And that was an extraordinary case. And there's sort of a funny end to it. Forsyth was probably in his 30s, and he had a car, he had a vehicle that belonged to his company, Forsyth Title and Escrow. And we knew he had it, and I wasn't in any hurry to pick it up. It was his only means of transportation. But the day came when I had to get it and sell it toward the end of the case. And he wouldn't give it back. And so Goo would go to his neighborhood every day and do his workout. He would run through the neighborhood. And one day, Forsyth came out of the garage in the vehicle, and Goo ran to his car and chased him down at the Bluegrass Country Club. Let him let him tee off and go out onto the golf course, and then Goo called Bobby Colson and had Bobby Colson send over a wrecker, and we towed his car away from the Bluegrass Golf and Country Club while he was out playing golf with his buddies. That's just one of the fun things that you get to do when you're a bankruptcy trustee or you're working for someone that wants a problem solved. So, it's just whatever.
What was the story with One Point Solutions?
Oh, that was Barry Stokes. Barry Stokes also had a Ponzi scheme. He had a cafeteria plan for benefits for employees and for 401ks, and he stole from them. And that was also a bankruptcy. And we went in.
You were appointed trustee again.
I was appointed trustee again.
And what triggered that? Why did you get appointed trustee then?
Because he had filed bankruptcy. He had filed a Chapter 11, I believe. And we had to go out to Dixon, Tennessee. That's where he had wonderful offices out there in a refurbished antique building, and it was locked. And it was locked because the electricity was off to the building. The FBI was after him. I do not count the FBI as an enemy. I count them as being a competitor. And they couldn't get in the building. We couldn't get in the building. I literally ran down to the electric company and said, what will it cost to get the electricity on in that building? It was $88. I wrote them a check out of my personal checking account and got the electricity turned on. The guy went back immediately and turned the electricity on. We had a key to the building and we got in. You had to have the key because the locks were all magnetic. You had to have the key, but we couldn't get in. We couldn't pick the lock. That wouldn't work because the locks were magnetic. And they were locked in place until the electricity came on. That's how that worked. But that case went in all kinds of directions. One was that Barry had collected Japanese woodblock prints with the money that he was stealing. And I ended up selling in Chicago at a gallery there, an auction gallery there, almost very close to $1 million worth of Japanese woodblock prints. And we know that there are about $80,000. We accounted. He had an inventory of his woodblock prints, and we know that there are about $80,000 that are hidden of woodblock prints at the prices at the time of the case. They're probably worth more today. They're hidden somewhere. He died in prison. We went right before he was sentenced and gave him an opportunity to tell us where the woodblock prints were, and he denied that he just thought it was a joke. And I think it was a mistake for him because I think it might have resulted in a shorter sentence, but he might have died in prison anyway. But he wouldn't pay any attention to us. But there was a funny thing that happened in that case. at the very beginning, we were scared to death because we didn't know who the enemy was. We knew Barry was the enemy. We can keep Barry out of the place, but that doesn't mean that he didn't have loyal employees. But we didn't have any money. We didn't have anything with which to hire the kind of accounting skill that you need to work on a case like that. We had to keep some of the employees. And Mike had a big meeting set up with all of the employees to talk about what we were going to be doing in the coming months and find out who had what skills, etc. And Mike said, one of the things that we need is a list of all of the checks that Barry Stokes has written to himself from company funds over the last 2 or 3 years. The company wasn't very old, so for the full history of the company. Well, there were 2 little ladies, like Ethel and Myrtle or something like that, down at the end of the table. And they looked over at me and says, "We can do that." And I said, "Well, go ahead. Go do it." And about 15 or 20 minutes later, they came back with this printout on this computer paper that folds over itself, and at any rate. And they handed it to me, and it was a list of every check he had written to himself. And I start reading through it, and it stopped about 2 years or 3 years before the present date. And I motioned to Mike. I said, "Hold up, Mike." And I said, "Ladies, why does this list stop about 2.5 years ago?" And Ethel or Myrtle or whatever her name was looks at me and says, "Oh, that's when the Lord called him to electronic transfer." And Mike and I could hardly, I think I probably just blurted out laughing. But I said, "Well, let's go back and try again, and let's include the Lord's electronic transfer." They did, and they nailed it. So we kept them.
All right. How about David Rutherford? Tell me about him.
David Rutherford, number one thing, an unsung hero. He was in the Merchant Marine during World War II and made some unbelievable number of crossings of the English Channel and other convoy duties where he could have been blown out of the ocean at any time by German submarines. And I always held him up as, these invisible people that walk around you when you're walking up and down the sidewalk, and you have no earthly idea what has happened to them in their lives. And then you find out just a little piece of it. And so that's one of the things that comes to my mind about David Rutherford. But he was just eaten up with the history of Nashville. He loved it, and he collected the history of the Nashville Bar Association. And he was the history committee. He did it himself. He wasn't out trying to set up any organization. He just did it. And Bill Ramsey got him to write his books, or maybe Rutherford got Bill Ramsey to help him get the money necessary to write the books, whatever. That's a story that Bill Ramsey can tell in his oral history. But David ended up writing 2 books about the Bar Association. But he was always there. He remembered people. He told great stories about things that had happened in courtrooms where he had been. And he was just the historical memory of the Nashville Bar Association, and then he died. The history committee of the Bar Association up to that point, because of the way that David Rutherford had kept up with the history of the Bar Association, had really become the Memorial Service Committee. And that's what they did. They set up the Memorial Service program at the Downtown Presbyterian Church, which was on the Thursday before Thanksgiving every year. And a year went by, and I said, we're not collecting the history. And 2 years went by, and I called up the president of the Bar Association, Sims, not a best.
Scott Sims?
Scott Sims. And I said, I need to talk to you. And we went to lunch, and he paid for lunch. I want the history to note that. Scott Sims paid for my lunch. And I told him Nashville had lost David Rutherford, and nobody really wanted to believe that he was dead, and that we had to reorganize the history committee, and it had to start gathering the history of the Bar Association. And he listened, and then he said, okay, we're going to have a blue ribbon committee. Go pick the members of the committee. You're the chairman. Get to work. And that's what happened. We really put, Bill Koch was on that committee, the former head of the Tennessee Bar Association was on the committee. It was a wonderful, Bill Willis was on that committee. There were a lot of people, good people. I wish I had their names to call out right now. Were on that committee, and we met primarily at the Tennessee Supreme Court because Bill Koch was on the committee. And we talked out what we thought the best possible historical committee for the Bar Association would look like. And we drew up sort of a bylaws for it. And by that time, Scott Sims had rotated out of office, and Trey Harwell came on. And he didn't know what had been going on. We had been operating sort of out of the sight of the bars. They were waiting for us to report. They weren't involving themselves in the committee's activities. And I think Christina Norris was slated to be the next head of the history committee. And I took the newly created historical committee guidelines to, I'm pretty sure it was Christina, and I said, this is your committee and this is what you need to do. And she looked at that and says, you're crazy. She says, all I do is the memorial service. And so we called Trey Hartwell, and the next thing I knew, I was the first chairman of the historical committee. We started meeting in Hal Hardin's office, where we still meet to this day. And it is my job to send out the invitation to the historical committee meeting each month. And it is supposed to be funny. And one day I said we would be meeting in the Lawyer Skinner conference room, and Hal Hardin's office. Well, there's only one conference room in Hal Hardin's office, but I named it the Lawyer Skinner conference room. Well, Lawyer Skinner was one of Nashville Bar's great characters, and he, in his 60s, he was still playing basketball for the on one of the Bar Association basketball teams, and he was just an amazing guy. And
he looked like the deputy in Mayberry.
Yes, he did. Exactly. And Hal Hardin thought that was the most wonderful thing in the world, and it has been the Lawyer Skinner conference room ever since, and he even talked to Mrs. Skinner about having a little ceremony. I don't think it's ever occurred, but
So how did the historical committee get involved in taking these oral histories?
Oh, that was one of the divisions of the responsibility of the committee, was to start doing oral histories. And
What is that?
Hal Hardin and Gareth Aiden set that up, and we now have, this year, it looks like we will have 100 oral histories by the end of the year. And you got to understand, those are oral histories that haven't been done by the state. Like Jim Neal done by the state, and so we don't duplicate that. And we've really, I
And
think.
this is one of the oral histories for the Nashville Bar Association, what we're doing right now.
That's right.
So it was somebody's idea to start interviewing lawyers who had been in the bar for a certain number of years.
That's right. We finally settled on 70 years old, or if your health was declining, any age at all.
And what criteria do you use to select people to be interviewed?
At first, we were looking for trial lawyers, and that quickly, the first committee in the Bar Association to say, wait a minute, hold on, you may never see us in court, but we're a big part of law in Nashville, and that was the copyright people, the Music Row lawyers. They wanted to get some of their people interviewed, and Dick Franks being one of the first on the list, and we got him. And so with that, it began to expand to everybody. But at first, there was sort of a prejudice toward the trial lawyers.
How many have you conducted?
Oh, 3 or 4, not very many.
And how did this Memorial Resolutions event come about, and what is happening with it?
Okay, the memorial resolutions are pretty amazing because we have more than 100 years of them. Every time we have a memorial service, there are memorial resolutions that are written and spread on the minutes. We have so many deaths now that we have to limit the oral presentation of memorial resolutions to 3 or 4 minutes. But that doesn't mean that the resolution itself, the written document, may be 15 or 20 pages. And they are scanned and they're put online so that people can read them. People who are doing genealogy can go and get Uncle Philbrick's memorial resolution. It may be a pack full of lies, but it's what his buddies said about him. And they're there, and they had been in books in the Chancery Court. And you talk about something that was delicate, was getting those books out of the Chancery Court and up to Waller, Lanston, Dortch, and Davis to be scanned. And Frank Amazing Grace provided the scanner and some of the elbow grease on that. And I think the other was Paul DeWitt, Ward DeWitt's son, who is an assistant district attorney general. And I think they actually came on Saturdays and took the books from the clerk and master's office and scanned them so that we would have those records public now. And it's, as time goes on, more and more people doing genealogies will recognize, just like our collection, our photo archive. Someday we'll sell photographs from that photo archive. It'll be a revenue source.
What is the historical continuing legal education?
I'm sorry,
What is the historical continuing legal education?
Oh, that that started when Baker versus Carr was about to have its 50th anniversary, maybe. I think that's right. And I don't want to take all the credit but I just thought we needed to do something. When the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court says, and not just any Chief Justice, Earl Warren, who presided over some of the most earth-shaking cases that our nation has ever had, said the most important case that I participated in while I was on the court was
Baker.
Baker versus Carr. And okay, and I just thought that Nashville had played such a big role in that case that we needed to do a program. And I think I was the chairman of the historical committee when that happened, and I kept pushing about it. Let's do something, let's do something. And it just happened. And it happened because Ed Yarborough and Ed Landquist, the two Eds, sometimes referred to as handsome Ed and not so handsome Ed, or pretty Ed and ugly Ed, but whatever. They're two, well, they've both been president of the Bar Association. And I mean, these are really active people and good people. And they picked up on this and they said, we are going to do this. And they made it happen.
So what now the historical committee is doing is an annual seminar?
We do an annual seminar on a historical topic and a continuing legal education seminar.
Some case.
Yeah, we've done Hoffa, we've done the little girl who was...
Trimble.
Yeah, Marcia Trimble. We've done Stringbean Ackerman.
Right.
David Stringbean Ackerman was one of our...
A lot of the criminal cases that have been rather sensational or memorable.
Yeah.
With the original actors to the extent possible.
That's right. People who participated, if we can get them.
And this is free for...
It's free. The money actually comes from the federal court library committee. And they get the fee when someone is sworn in as a new lawyer at the federal court. And it's pretty rich little trust fund. And they pay each year so that the Bar Association doesn't take a loss on the program. And that's the way that works.
Well, the courthouse really got hurt, I think, as did a lot of Nashville with the flood of 2010.
Yes.
And you had a pig case.
The pig case. I was sitting in my office. Of course, Nashville was going blub, 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 blub. It was
Underwater.
It was underwater. Terrible flood. And one of the places that floods was out in Bellevue, in the big condominium developments out there. And I get a call from Gary Thompson in the State Attorney General's office. And he says, John, this is Gary up at the State Attorney General's office. Well, and we're working on flood relief. Well, I imagined that they had pulled a bunch of tables and desks together, and I could see the State Attorney General, who was a very good friend, and still is. Oh my goodness. I'm just having him say
Another lawyer.
Another lawyer, senior moment. What's the name of our congressman right now?
Jim Cooper?
Cooper. Okay, Cooper.
So Bob Cooper.
Bob Cooper
was
the State Attorney General. And I envisioned Bob Cooper sitting next to Gary Thompson at a table making phone calls, and he said, we have a lady over here and we think she needs bankruptcy. Will you take her? And I said, yes, because I could see Gary, if I said no, I could see Gary Thompson looking over at Bob Cooper and saying, you're not going to believe this, but McLemore just turned us down on a bankruptcy, and it would be the end of that relationship. And so I said, sure, send her over. I had no earthly idea. So,
Who was it?
And so it was Miss Pig, okay, Sherry Pig. And she had stayed with her. She lost her condominium. The water got up to the ceiling of the first floor. But she had stayed with the elderly couple next door, got them to the second floor, and made sure that they were safe, and had stayed with them until they could be rescued. She was a hero. And she was a person, like so many in Nashville, who wanted to create something theatrical, and she had put all of the equity in her house into a project that she had. And so there was, we'll just say, about $200,000 owed on her condominium. And she wasn't going to go back there. It had to be stripped completely, all insulation taken out, all wallboard taken out, everything. And she needed to file bankruptcy. She just needed to get rid of all this debt. And she came into our office, and I walked out to greet her, and she looks across the central portion of our office where the secretarial desks are and everything. She sees Mike Curry, runs over and hugs Mike Curry. And I thought, what in the world is going on here? Mike had been at her house pulling the insulation out the preceding weekend on a church project from his church down in Pulaski. And she had met him there. And so Mike ends up introducing me to my client. And we have to have a little flashback here. I had been in a program, continuing legal education program, where George Payne had spoken. And he had made a comment about a particular statute that he did not like. And it was one that said that you could not discharge any homeowners association dues that accumulated after you filed bankruptcy. That the filing of the bankruptcy would not stop the accumulation of homeowners association dues. It's very inequitable statute because if the individual moves out of the place and goes away, and the homeowners association can do what it's going to get paid when the property gets foreclosed on anyway. It was just a bad law. It was a bad law, and George had said that. Well, we got George Payne as our judge. Computer appointed him, and I put it in the back of my mind, if this homeowners association comes after Sherry, I'm going after the homeowners association. Before Payne, I'll find some way to get her out of those homeowners association dues because they were accumulating. She was not living in the property. She had moved somewhere else. She had no intention of coming back. And it happened. The homeowners association came after her. And I was right. George Payne found a way. And it was not appealed. And I got her out of those homeowners association dues. So about a year later, she calls me up and she says, my mortgage company continues to try to collect from me. I wrote them a letter and told them to stop. And it turns out the mortgage has been sold to another mortgage company. And I wrote a really big letter to them pointing out that the debt had been discharged, blah, blah, blah. Sent them about 2 inches of paper to explain exactly what had happened. And they wouldn't let up. And so we sued them. And we got our $19,000. She split that halvesies with us. That wasn't pro bono. She split it halvesies with us. But
that's what happened.
the amazing thing was she really didn't have any money. And she knew that I like chocolate chip cookies. And so she went and she got this, I think maybe a cake and that had chocolate chips in it and chocolate chip cookies. And she knew that I didn't drink alcoholic beverages. She got some sort of red juice, and she set up our conference table. We all went in. We held hands and sang Amazing Grace.
It's very touching. I'll give you a moment. You've had a lot of memorable events happen. You do have one about the decline in bankruptcies with the Affordable Care Act.
The Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, as the Affordable Care Act was going into effect in various states in various different ways. In Tennessee, it's called TennCare, and you can argue all day long about whether that's really the Affordable Care Act or not, but it helps people get their medical bills paid. In Tennessee, before the Affordable Care Act, somewhere between 50 and 55% of all of our bankruptcies were caused by medical debt. And after the TennCare went into effect, it's just plummeted. And it plummeted around the nation as the Affordable Care Act went into effect. And today, we have about half the number of bankruptcies that we had this time 10 or 15 years ago. It's pretty amazing. And people don't realize that.
The award for the financial problems resolution for the York family.
Oh, I was trustee in bankruptcy for at least 6 direct descendants of Alvin York when I was the bankruptcy trustee in Cookeville for 34 years, from 1980 to 14. I was the only trustee working in the Upper Cumberland. And during that time, I had these people, and just like in the movie, Alvin York really couldn't manage his money, and apparently that's a genetic trait, and it was just something that happened. So of all of them, there was a guy I call Alvin York IV. That was not his name. There was no Alvin York IV. But he was the great grandchild of Alvin York. Arnold Lefkowitz represented him. And when they came up for their meeting of creditors, Arnold told me, "This is my client. He is Sergeant York's great grandson." Arnold told me that before the hearing. He didn't put it on the record. Well, I always try to say something encouraging to people if they've done a good job and if they're deserving of their bankruptcy. And so I asked this guy, I said, "By the way, are you Sergeant York's grandson?" And he says, "No, sir. I'm his great-grandson." I said, Of course, I'm sorry." And I said, "Well, I just want you to know that when that movie comes on," of course, that'd be Sergeant York, I always stop and watch for a little while. I stop and watch because it's a good movie. And I stop and watch because I'm proud of your great-grandfather and his military exploits, but I'm more proud of what he tried to do for education in the Upper Cumberland by the creation of the York Institute. And he looked at me, and he reached over the table and took my hand. And he said, "Now you understand, the man in that movie was Mr. Gary Cooper." I bit my lip. I looked around the room. It was a full hearing room. There were lawyers doing about faces and facing the wall. The other debtors somehow kept their cool. And I said, how am I going to get out of this? And I said, well, I guess he was the spirit of your great granddaddy. And he says, I reckon that'd be right. And I said, you've done a good job on your bankruptcy petition and schedules, and you can go now. And he walked out of the room, and there was 15, 20 seconds passed until he got out of earshot of us, we hope. And then simultaneously, the entire room just erupted in laughter. And back then, we always went to lunch. All the lawyers, all the creditors would go to lunch at the same place. And during lunch that day, people were reaching over and taking each other's hands and saying, and that would be Mr. Gary Cooper. And we would all laugh again.
Well, tell me a little.
But so, wait a minute. So when I had to resign from the Upper Cumberland because I was losing money. It was costing me about $5,000 a year to go up there. I just couldn't do it anymore. I hated to leave. But they had a party. And one of the county, I think it's the Fentress County mayor, the Fentress County mayor had these little proclamations he'd had printed up. And he gave me one for caring for the financial needs of the York family for 34 years.
Whoa.
And it hangs on the wall of my office to this day.
That needs to go in the archives. What about Care America?
I don't know, I'm not everybody else, but I have an idea that every man has a point in his life when he says to himself, like it or not, I'm no longer a boy. I'm a man now. And
I think it's mostly men that say that.
yeah, I think that's right. I don't think women have to do that. But I think a man needs to do that. And I've always been pretty lighthearted type of person and can find a joke where other people would never dream that one existed. But at any rate, I was bopping along, doing my job as a bankruptcy trustee, when I get a call from Bob Goodrich at Ferris Warfield in Canada, probably at that time. John, we need you to be a receiver in the Chancery Court. Sure, Bob. That's what I do. I'm a fiduciary. I can do that. I've done it for the federal court. No reason I can't do it for the state court. What is it that you got that needs to be received? And he said, a nursing home. And the name was Care America, and it was over by the women's prison. And it was brand new. And I went over to Chancery Court, and I talked to Bob, and I said, now look, I'll take over this receivership, but there's human beings involved here, and they've got to be fed. And don't worry, John, there'll be money. There'll be money. Don't worry about it at all. And I said, okay. I'm going to do this. And I was appointed and out the door and on my way to Care America, where I found out they did not have breakfast. They did not have enough food to feed those people the next morning. And there was a meeting at 8 o'clock that night at Third National Bank. And I had done my reconnaissance. I knew my situation. I walked into the room as normal John McLemore, not changed from since the day I got married, okay, which was a little change in my normal way of doing things. And I kept waiting for Mr. Big, whoever that was, at the bank, to come into the room. And I start seeing these lawyers. Lawyers that are my peers, like Bob Goodrich, walk into the room and sit down and take a seat. And Mr. Big, I'd worked with Mr. Big before, and there were Barry Holt's father, Mr. Holt. Oh, well, anyway, Mr. Holt would hire out to the bank to handle really tough situations. And I was expecting someone like him to walk in the room. And we sat there for a few minutes, and I looked over at Bob and I said, where's Mr. Big? Where's the... And Bob says, this is it, John. We're it. And I turned white as a sheet, I'm sure, because I had more than 100 mouths to feed, and I had about 7 or 8 hours to get them food. And at that moment, I wasn't a boy anymore.
You were Mr. Big.
What?
You were Mr. Big.
I was Mr. Big. And the first thing that Mr. Big did, and don't ask me how I got his phone number. I guess I got it out of the phone directory. We had such a thing back then. I called John Clay. And he was the highest person at the bank I knew anything about. And I expect he was running it. And I told him the situation. And he said, we'll get you some money. I said, you're going to get me some money before midnight. I want $5,000 in cash. I want it at my office. And if you don't get it here, I own a radio station right now, WWTN radio station. Wasn't much of a radio station, but it was a radio station. And I said, I will be on the radio in the morning telling anybody who can hear that signal that Third National Bank is not feeding these people. And I will ask for the women of First Baptist Church and First Baptist Church Capitol Hill to pull together, get food, and come and feed these people, even though I don't know medically what they're supposed to be eating. But I will feed them something, and I will talk about you not getting me $5,000 by midnight. Amazingly enough, $5,000 in cash from a bank that's got its vault door locked with a time lock appeared at my office about 10:30 that night, and we got the money to the people who knew what needed to be purchased, and they went and bought it at the Kroger store that's open. And we ended up having to evacuate that facility. And I also learned about recasting bonds in that case. It was a wonderful experience, and I was no longer a boy.
Now, you have another amazing story, I think, about Deep Throat.
Well, we're going back to when I was a...
I don't know. But I know that that's one thing I need to ask you about.
Frank DeRoda, when the obscenity case was brought.
This is in the 70s sometime.
Yeah, it was in the 70s when I was a newspaper reporter. Kenneth Jost and I were asked by Frank DeRoda to be on the jury of view for Deep Throat. And Deep Throat, in order for the jury of view to view the evidence, Deep Throat had to be shown in the Chancery Court. My gosh, this you talk about heresy. This was something. But that courtroom was packed. I would have given anything to have had a camera and gotten everybody to say to everybody, smile, to have a picture of the people. It would be a classic shot some very, very straight-laced lawyers who were so curious about this evidence, they needed to come and view it with the jury of view. And the jury of view did not unanimously vote that the program was, that the film was obscene. And to rub salt into Frank DeRota's wounds, I wrote the next day all about what had happened in the jury room, etc. Well, Frank just overruled his jury of view and went on with his life. But every single time I met Frank DeRota, from then until the time of his death, most often I would see him at social events where his wife, Claire, was with him. And he would always begin, "Claire, you remember John McLemore. He was on the Deep Throat jury of view." And he delighted in doing it, the more people that were standing around.
That may be on your tombstone.
It may be.
What was the Lem Manners story?
That was one of the more poignant moments that I've ever had as a newspaper reporter. There were not many poignant moments. Lem Manners was a moonshiner. He made illegal alcohol. And he was notorious for it. He was in Stewart County. And every member of his family, he had several sons, and they had all gone to federal prison for making illegal alcohol. He never saw anything wrong with making illegal alcohol. And he had a son on trial in the U.S. District Court before Frank Gray Jr. And I saw him sitting on a bench outside the courtroom during a recess by himself. And I walked over and sat down next to him. And I said, "Tell me about it, Lem, what it's like when you know your son's going to go to federal prison." And we talked a little bit. He said, "There's nothing wrong in the world wrong with what we do." And he was serious. And then he looked at me and he said, "My youngest boy broke into the high school and stole a trombone. Something wrong with that boy." Like there wasn't anything wrong with the others. That was a crime. Stealing that trombone was wrong. Making whiskey wasn't. And that's just, it's been with me ever since he said it. And there was no way to write it in a story about the case or anything else. It's just one of those things that sticks in your brain. Something wrong with that boy.
The act as fiduciary for the Lloyd's Farm One? What was that?
That's, if you're going to ask me at the very end to make some sort of final statement, that's what that's
Well,
about.
I am, but before I do that, I want to know, what are your current activities right now?
What am I doing right now?
Yeah, current activities. You're still practicing.
Oh, yeah, I'm still practicing. I'm still a bankruptcy
I
trustee.
think you might have wrapped up a case I appointed you in.
And I haven't wrapped it up yet. But I'm currently, Marathon Village is tied up in a big divorce, and I write all the checks for Marathon Village. The court in Williamson County does not think that the husband is responsible enough to pay his own bills without paying too much to himself. And so I counsel with him every week and pay all the bills at Marathon Village, and it's pretty interesting.
And what does Marathon Village do or did?
It does. It is first and foremost an office complex that is located in the former manufacturing building for the Marathon automobile.
Located where?
Well, right along the CSX main line, right over by the Baptist Sunday School Board. Well, it's called Lifeway. Lifeway, in the Lifeway new building on 11th Avenue, I believe. And it's right over in that area by the interstate and the railroad.
And you're managing it?
I am.
And how much more time do you think it will consume?
It all depends on the Court of Appeals has it. The issue that's holding everything up is a prenuptial agreement, and whether or not it is binding. And so it could go all the way to the state Supreme Court. It's been argued before the Court of Appeals. And meanwhile, every week, I do spend some time managing the Marathon Village.
So part of your current activities are being active in your practice.
Yeah.
What else do you do?
What else do I do? Well, I take pictures.
And are you active at church?
Oh, yeah, yeah. I was for at least 20 years, I was a librarian at the Forest Hills Baptist Church. They decided that my library collection was too secular for them. They got a new librarian, but that's okay. I had a good run at it. But I go to church every Sunday, and so does my wife.
And I guess you're not active with the Boy Scouts anymore,
No, not with the Boy Scouts anymore.
but you were.
I was. Our son, with the possible exception of the fact that our son had the same parents from the day he was born until the day he left for college. I think Boy Scouts were the biggest influence in his life, more than school, more than church.
That's very impressive.
It was just right. It was right for him. And we have two daughters, and they were both Gold Scouts in the Girl Scout program. It just doesn't have the pizzazz that the Eagle Scout Award does. But our son was an Eagle Scout, and they were both Gold Scouts. We have one daughter who, as a result of the Girl Scout program, is an extraordinary canoeist, and she spent her summers with the Girl Scouts up in the Quetico Provincial Park in Canada. And scouting meant a lot to our family.
What projects are yet to be accomplished by John McLemore?
Ooh. Steve Ramp, let me go back a ways. Steve Ramp was a wonderful young lawyer at Ferris Warfield in Canada, which I've mentioned before. He was fourth on the letterhead after Ferris Warfield in Canada. And he was brilliant. And one day I went to a meeting, and he was sitting at the head of the table, and he announced that he would no longer be able to participate. I think it was the Mid-South Commercial Law Institute. And we were going to ask him to be president the coming year. And he said no, that he couldn't do that, that he was going to give up the law and go to the seminary at Princeton and become a minister. I was floored. This guy was on fire like a rocket. He was going to be president of the Bar Association. He was going to be a really, really fine commercial lawyer, which I know what the good ones can do, and he was going to be one who could do it. And so when the meeting was over, I just went up to him, and being the blunt McLemore that I am, I said, "Why are you doing this?" And he looked at me so seriously, and he said, "A couple of weeks ago, John, I stepped onto a locomotive and I sold it at auction. And he said, It doesn't get any better than that. He says, I've done it all. And the Lord's calling me to be a minister. And he gave me an opportunity to step away, because you think about it. You sell a locomotive, what else can there be? The fact of the matter was, he had been receiver of a junkyard, or he was foreclosing on a junkyard, and they had a locomotive. And it wasn't like a locomotive that's running down the tracks out here. It was one that was pulling some steel around a 40-acre tract or something. But you appointed me in the Meadows case. And Mr. Meadows, the father, died. The case sort of fell apart at that time, at least I thought it did. And you very graciously got me paid for the work that I'd done as receiver in that case. And I went on about my business until Chancellor Martin, your successor, called me on the phone and says, John, we need you back. The Meadows own a caboose, a CSX steel caboose. And I thought, that could be my Steve Ramp exit, to sell that caboose. It sits across the street from their house. It's for the children in the community to look at and come by, and they decorate it at Christmas. But it's in very good condition. And I could see myself selling that caboose. And maybe I did too good a job, but the family agreed on who's going to get the caboose, and it's not going to be sold. So I'm going to be in it for a little bit while longer. What else could I accomplish? I think it will be...
You have done a lot. Because one of the things that you've said is this, I've done it all. You've operated a goat brokerage.
Oh, goat brokerage?
A dairy farm.
Yes.
Run a truck line.
Yep.
Run a car rental company.
Yep.
And sold as much property at auction that you were named
the consumer member of the Tennessee Auctioneer Commission. Yes, that's right.
So with all that under your belt, what do you think you want to accomplish going out? You're not going to sell the caboose.
It'll probably be in the area of photography. I want to do better, and you have to have the time. If you're going to pursue your art, you've got to have the time.
And in closing, what does your retirement look like? Probably photography, from what you've said. Is going to include anything else?
My father left me a wonderful woodworking shop, but I have Parkinson's disease, and I don't know if that's going to be possible or not, but I like to do that. I think photography is something that I can still do, because I can put the camera on a tripod and not shake it.
What closing words would you have?
I want to say this. I know they'll never listen to it, but there are people that are going to come behind me. I'm 71 years old, and I'm still getting the appointments, thank goodness. But there are young lawyers out there who are going to be fiduciaries. They're going to take over all kinds of things in the history. When I first started doing what I do, we grabbed books and records, boxes and boxes full of books and records. These kids are going to be, they're probably going to be able to take a device and walk over to a computer and lay it down on the top of the computer and type in something like, suck all the financial information out of this computer, and it'll just go, and it'll just take it out and put it in some sort of preordained form for them, you know. But what I want to say to them is, read Gray Seas Under by Farley Mowat. It is the story of a salvage ship that went into the Atlantic during World War II to salvage boats that were in distress. and think of yourself as that salvage ship. When a salvage ship approaches a wreck on the high seas, they really do shoot a line with explosives. They shoot a line up onto the ship that's to be salvaged. And in a capsule on the end of that line is a contract. And it was at the time, back in the 1930s and 40s, when this ship was operating, it was called Lloyd's Form 1. And in that contract, it says that we will take you in tow, we will salvage your cargo, we will salvage your ship, and our fee will be determined in admiralty. And it will be high, because you're not just paying for the salvaging of your ship. You're paying us for having been ready to salvage your ship. Always, if you do what I do, be ready to say, I'm on my way, I'm coming.